Cyclops is the greatest of the X-Men. Now, it might not seem that way if you only watch the Bryan Singer X-Men movies, but with the return of the X-Men 97 cartoon, I think a lot more people are on board with Cyclops as a character because that show just did him so well, and I hope we continue to see Cyclops being done well and the face of the X-Men when it comes to their introduction to the MCU, which even me, I'm kind of done with the MCU, but I'd be all back in for X-Men. Now, his impact on the X-Men, his presence is just so much within the X-Men that whenever he's gone, whether it be he's dead or he's just not on the team, it doesn't even feel like the X-Men to me anymore. There's obviously a massive hole missing in the team, and that's because there's so many key dynamics between Cyclops and other characters that it just feels way off. And I feel like that does sound like it limits creativity a lot, and it probably does, but at the same time, Cyclops is just that crucial of a character to the X-Men. Not to say that he cannot ever be replaced. Wolverine and Storm have served that role pretty well, but I feel like even then, those two, despite their presence within the story and their value as characters, they're still a far cry from Cyclops as the team leader. This much was even said during the Krakoa era multiple times, where basically Cyclops is the X-Men. Obviously not the only one, but he is just such a crucial figurehead for the X-Men as a whole, and that's something I would 100% agree with. Now, what is also important to understand about the series is that he's basically in the position of Superman or Captain America for the Justice League and the Avengers respectively. And this does bring in some key dynamics that I mentioned earlier, that being Cyclops and Wolverine. That's very much the main character, the Boy Scout, and the wild card for the series. This can be seen in Captain America and Iron Man, Cap obviously being the Boy Scout, Iron Man the wild card, and Superman and Batman. Like, this is a bread and butter combo. It is a key dynamic within the X-Men itself and all of these other team books. I'd say you have to have this dynamic if you really want a long-lasting team book. Obviously, another aspect that limits creativity, but it's very interesting to see, and I feel like the audiences would agree with that if you pointed it out to them. Now, there are things that separate Cyclops from Captain America and Superman, this being the constant deconstructions and reconstructions of his character. Now, that's not to say that this never happens with Superman or Captain America, because that would be a lie, especially when it comes to Captain America, who is basically just the figurehead for America. So there's a lot of political commentary to be made through Captain America, so that's just something that's going to happen, but it's not to the extent that it's done with Cyclops. For some reason, they do really go all in on breaking down Cyclops as a character, building him back up, and doing it again. And it's not always in the same way, which is what makes it refreshing and makes it interesting. They decide to do it in different ways almost every single time, that especially in the modern era. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, the modern era of X-Men. Of course, check out the Claremont era. It is essential to knowing the status quo of the X-Men, how they got made into the way that they are today. Don't get me wrong, Stan Lee did a lot for the X-Men. He's the one who created them, but Claremont is the architect for how they are today and why there's so many subversions and deconstructions. It's because of the way that he set them up. That is all besides the point. New X-Men, the beginning of what I pretty much consider the valuable reading in terms of the modern era. This is really where the deconstructions of Cyclops start to happen, and you can really see it just how it deconstructs the entire X-Men from the very beginning. Morrison had a clear goal whenever he made this series, and it was to bring the X-Men kind of away from the whole superhero-isms that was popular throughout the entirety of the X-Men. They didn't even wear superhero outfits. They wore like black leather and stuff like that. It's a bit ridiculous, but there's a ton of details that really display the intent of Morrison throughout this entire run. And you can also feel this in the character writing for Cyclops, because during this, he's suffering from a lot of trauma due to being possessed by Apocalypse. And of course, Jean is getting possessed with the Phoenix Force once again. So there's a lot that's really stressing Cyclops out. And this leads him to getting manipulated by Emma Frost, which leads to one of the most infamous moments in X-Men history where he is pretty much committing psychological adultery with Emma Frost. And just one of the most wild X-Men moments of all time, which I think it still comes second to what comes later on in their dynamic, I guess. But Cyclops continues to get broken down throughout this entire run, and it's not until the very end where things start to, I guess, look up a little bit for him, because at the end of New X-Men, Jean dies. Of course she dies, once again, killed by Wolverine, and on her grave, because at this time, Jean and Scott were still together, she gives him permission to move on. So Scott and Emma Frost make out on her grave, which is the most, I think, one of the most insane moments that I've ever read in a comic, just based on how wild it was. Just very wild actions taken by the two of them that time. And so we have to deal with Cyclops still suffering from a lot of trauma, just in a new trauma, that being the death of Jean Grey instead of being possessed by Apocalypse. And this leads directly into Astonishing X-Men, which is basically the inverse of everything that New X-Men tried to be. And that's actually why I think this storyline, this series, this run is so good, because it is the complete inverse, but it still uses everything that happened in New X-Men. And Joss Whedon has said that he respects what Morrison did in New X-Men. So despite Whedon being a terrible person, of course, this is where you separate the art from the artist, if you can, because there's some examples where I haven't been able to do that, like Rurouni Kenshin. I just can't read that series. So if you can't read this, that sucks, because I really do think that this is the best X-Men run that I've ever read, and that's because a lot of it is the work it does with Cyclops as the main character of the arc. And at the beginning, he is at the lowest that he's ever been, and Wolverine is calling him out on it, because Wolverine is the one that killed Jean. And of course, the Scott, Logan, Jean triangle is just very complicated, but it does lead to Wolverine kind of looking out for Scott in maybe an unintentional way, but a way that does bring back Scott to who he's supposed to be. But it's something that happens over time. Same thing with Emma Frost. Despite her goals throughout this entire run, she does end up helping out Scott a lot as well. And this all culminates in the very end of the arc, where Scott is able to control his vision, which sounds confusing because there's a retcon that happens here that's not exactly accurate to the character, and it leads a lot of people to complain about this run. But it's something that I actually really liked. And basically, Emma helps Scott with his trauma. Basically, what she was supposed to be doing all along, being his therapist, just not in a weird way that's pretty predatory. But basically, she helps him out with a lot of his trauma, and that ends up allowing him to be able to control his abilities for the first time ever. And it led to one of the coolest moments in all of the X-Men series for me, but it is something that just blatantly bothered some people. So I can see why it bothers people, but it just doesn't bother me. I thought it was really cool, and I liked seeing Cyclops grow throughout this entire series. And now that Scott is up, he has to be brought back down, and this is done through the House of M. And if you don't know what this event is, it's basically where Scarlet Witch ends up reality warping the mutants out of existence. She says no more mutants, so she takes away the abilities of countless mutants, and then on top of that, no more mutants are being born. So this is just a huge moment for all of the mutants in the entire Marvel Universe, and it brings a lot of stress to Scott that basically makes him unhinged by the end of this next era of X-Men. But my favorite aspect of this decimation era of the X-Men, where they're pretty much at the lowest that they've ever been for mutantdom as a whole, not really for Scott, it's the slow progression of Scott when it comes to him just slowly becoming more unhinged as the series goes on, to where he starts basically ordering people to kill opposing factions or members of opposing factions. And then on top of that, the just cherry on top of the cake that really splits the X-Men down the middle is whenever he has children fight alongside the X-Men, which was a big deal for Wolverine, and that led to schism. But I guess to break it down a little bit more slowly, the Messiah trilogy is where this can all be seen in. And at the beginning, of course, the Messiah for the X-Men is Hope Summers. And she ends up, her entire village gets decimated because she's the firstborn mutant after what Scarlet Witch did. And this is, of course, a big deal for all of the X-Men, but it's a big deal for all the people that hate mutants. And they get there first. And so it's just one of the most brutal examples of the hatred that the mutants feel all the time. And this just leads to a lot of stress on the mutants as a whole. And when it comes to that stress, there's a pressure point. And the most significant pressure point is going to be on the leader. And this is Scott Summers, because Xavier's not really in the picture in that way anymore. He is an advisor to Scott because, like I said, Xavier is just a terrible person, and he has done terrible things to Scott to the point where he gets demoted out of the X-Men, out of that leadership position, and now it's all on Scott. And this is what leads him down that downward spiral. And after the Messiah trilogy, this is Schism. This is where Wolverine and Cyclops go head to head. This is the Civil War event for the X-Men. But that does lead me to talking about Civil War for a second. That event, it's heavily criticized. I think it sucks. It has a couple of really good moments that I think make the event as iconic as it is. And some of them are really funny, like Daredevil calling Tony Stark Judas, but it wasn't actually Matt, it was Danny in Daredevil's costume. But like, there's stuff like that that makes the Civil War event not really that good, but specifically the characters being written out of character. Tony Stark, basically anybody on Tony's side was just completely out of character throughout the entire event, and that's what separates it from Schism. We see Cyclops slowly go down this just rabbit hole of just becoming more and more unhinged as this storyline progresses. As people just get more brutal in their hatred towards mutants, Scott kind of just reacts to that hatred, and he wants to protect mutants, and he does some pretty crazy things to do that, stuff that eventually splits him and Logan completely apart. And it leads to a pretty epic final battle between the two of them, and a new status quo for the X-Men, to where now there's two different teams, Wolverine's team and Scott's team. And this is kind of like the Regenesis era of the X-Men, which I just didn't really like. This is the point of Scott's character where I just disconnected from him in a lot of ways, and that's just because his character seemed to disconnect from everything. He didn't really care about him anymore. He didn't really care about a lot of things after Schism, and I feel like that was just a misstep when it comes to the writing for Scott's character. I guess you can consider it maybe a logical step. Maybe after Schism he just becomes that type of character, but I feel like it could have been executed in a better way, to where he's just not this monotone, just boring-ish character, because he's so just disconnected with everything. I just don't think it works that well. But what ends up happening because of Regenesis, because everybody splits apart, now he is pretty much radicalized in almost every single way, and this leads to the conflict between the Avengers and the X-Men. And keep in mind, throughout this entire event, I would say the X-Men are in the right, just completely. And it's really hard for me to see the Avengers as the good guys in this event, despite how it's being presented. I feel like this is another event where it's just the writing was really weak at times in terms of representing these two heroic factions go off against each other and having them all feel in character. But I felt like they did a great job with Scott here. This is where he gets possessed by the Phoenix Force, and Comics Explained, I believe it was him, did a video on this talking about how Cyclops is the best X-Men villain, and I feel like I just disagree with that completely. Not to say that nothing that Scott did was villainous, but I feel like he's just not that type of character throughout this event, even though he is presented as the overall antagonist of everything. And I think that can be seen with Marvel now, because at the end of Avengers vs. X-Men, where Cyclops is possessed by the Phoenix Force by himself, in which somehow still people blame him for a lot of the actions that he took, despite Jean kind of getting the free pass whenever she was fully possessed by the Phoenix Force, and pretty much everybody else that did evil actions whenever they were possessed by the Phoenix Force, they get a pass, but Cyclops doesn't. So that's just a pretty wild aspect that keeps getting addressed constantly. Like, he's to blame for his actions completely, especially because what happens at the climax of Avengers vs. X-Men is Cyclops kills Professor Xavier. And he was 100% in the right to do so, because that's exactly what Xavier was trying to get him to do in a lot of ways. He was pressuring him in every single way. He knew which buttons to press. And at the same time, Xavier was just a terrible person. Like, he just sucks. And Scott killed him for it. But that does lead to Scott's arrest and him basically just saying, yeah, what I did was right. There are new mutants being born into the world, and I sacrificed my freedom, sacrificed just a lot for the mutants in general. And that aspect, I think, was executed really well. But of course, he cannot stay out of the X-Men. Like I said before, whenever he's not in the X-Men, it doesn't feel the same. And this is whenever Marvel Now is whenever the time-displaced X-Men become a thing. Kind of unfortunately, because time-displaced Jean just absolutely sucks. She is literally the worst X-Men character that plays a crucial role that I can think of. Like, she is that bad. She sucks. Time-displaced Scott, he's pretty cool, but he doesn't hold a candle to Scott Summers, just who he is, non-displaced Scott Summers. But when it comes to Marvel Now, he is set up. This is where you see a lot of, I guess, kind of Malcolm X comparisons to Scott Summers. This is where a lot of those people lean away from the comparisons to Magneto and start applying it to Scott Summers. And that's because a lot of the propaganda that gets pushed, not so much real life propaganda, but you see a lot of artwork of Scott Summers as this freedom fighter throughout all of Marvel Now, and he's this controversial figure, and that's where you'll see a lot of those comparisons, or at least that's where I have. And this is one of my favorite eras for Scott, because he's not really unhinged and detached anymore. He obviously cares a lot, but he has these moments where he does kind of go back to being that unhinged type character. But it's more like he just doesn't take any shit anymore. And he just has this set of beliefs that he continues to act on. And you see a lot more X-Men coming around to him. Like, of course, Kitty Pryde. She's one of the most significant members that joins him. But his team is mostly composed of more, I guess, not evil characters, but characters that are a little bit loose morally. Magneto obviously joins Scott Summers, and he has a very shady past. Emma Frost, same thing. And then Magic, who just has a very interesting personality and a lot of darker elements to her character. But then you start to get into the new characters that get recruited, characters like Goldballs, Tempest, a lot of these other characters that are a lot more lighthearted, and they have a really fun dynamic with all of the main characters, the older characters that are a little bit more broody. And I think I'm one of the few people that like this era of X-Men. Like, I feel like Bendis gets a lot of criticism for the way that he portrays the X-Men consistently. And a lot of that criticism is very valid, because there are some elements here that I just don't think are very well written, but at the same time, just the overall idea of this version of Scott Summers throughout this entire run is very interesting at times. So I'd say for the majority of it, and especially his dynamic with the time-displaced variants, that being mainly him, like Scott and time-displaced Scott, and Scott and time-displaced Jean, as insufferable as she is. But everything does kind of fall apart after Bendis leaves. That's where you see a lot of these theories that Marvel is kind of just hiding the X-Men away and pushing the Inhumans forward just because they don't own the rights to Fox, which is super unfortunate if that is the truth. I have seen people talk about it as if it was just like a confirmed truth, but I haven't seen any evidence myself to really confirm that. So It's kind of up in the air, but I could 100% believe it if it was the case. Like, it makes sense because the quality of X-Men after Bendis leaves drops off significantly. And this leads into Inhumans versus X-Men, which isn't really anything to even talk about when it comes to Cyclops, because he dies of the virus that... It's not really a virus, it's what turns Inhumans into Inhumans. It's toxic to mutants. This is pretty much how the X-Men got the boot in terms of just promoting the Inhumans. It's very much the Terrigen Mist is toxic to mutants. Despite that never being a thing before, it's a thing now, and you just kind of have to roll with it. And that's what killed Cyclops, unfortunately. But what really was cool about this event and this storyline is the fact that Emma kind of just like psychically imprinted Cyclops into the minds of pretty much everybody around, and it made him still a substantial figure throughout this entire arc. And I actually liked the twist that he actually died super early on, and it was Emma projecting him throughout this event. I thought I really liked that aspect. And this leads to the Resurrection era, where it's almost put all on the shoulders of time displaced Scott Summers, who isn't really a character I've talked about at all, and I'm still not going to talk about him, but he does have some pretty cool moments, especially on the Champions here. His dynamic with Kamala Khan is actually pretty neat. But Cyclops, the main main continuity, main timeline Cyclops does get resurrected here, and he's written by Matthew Rosenberg in Uncanny X-Men, which just, he's not a writer that I really connect with a lot. Like, I don't like a lot of his works, like what he did with Hawkeye or anything like that, but I actually like what he did here, which seems to be the lesser opinion, I guess. I guess less popular opinion is the better way to put it, because this arc, from what I can see, is kind of hated. And I can see why, because it's, once again, Scott being detached from a lot of things. He's very much a shadow of his former self. Is that how that saying goes? I'm not sure about the saying, but basically, he's not the man he used to be. And in a lot of ways, this is him coming back to that. And of this series, the most iconic moment is whenever he sees Jean Grey, he kind of just walks past Emma and the two embrace each other, which was just a super funny moment. Just seeing Emma get cucked in that way is just pretty wild. But overall, this series, despite me kind of liking it, there's a lot of issues with it, especially when it comes to Captain America showing up. They just make him stupid anytime he has to interact with the X-Men, to make the X-Men seem as just victimized as possible, despite, actively writing Captain America out of character to make Cyclops look very good, which is not something I'm going to be mad at, but I will acknowledge that Cap is often written out of character when he's on panel with Cyclops. And then finally, there's the Krakoan era, and this is Cyclops, or at least it can be interpreted as Cyclops at his peak. It is Dad Cyclops being a dad at the Summers home on the moon. His dynamic with his brothers, his children, and even his love interests are in the best state that they have ever been. This is despite the era having a huge sex culty undertone with the whole "make more mutants" line that Nightcrawler says, and the poly aspects of the era being heavily alluded to, capturing the supposed high point of mutantdom in the oddest way. There is an understandable critique here to be made. A lot of the characters are written insanely out of character in regards to this dynamic. There's absolutely no way that Scott, Wolverine, or Emma would be okay with any of this. The only reason I don't include Jean being against it are because, or at least two reasons. One, she led Wolverine on the entire time she was with Scott. And then two, I'm Jean Grey's biggest hater. That detour aside, I don't really want to undervalue just how great Cyclops was during Hickman's run within the Krakoan era. House and Powers, X of Swords, and the Hellfire Gala were all incredibly strong story beats for Cyclops. Jonathan Hickman didn't get the opportunity to see his original vision through, something that derailed a lot of what the Krakoan era had going for it from a quality writing perspective. Unfortunately, Cyclops' character writing is something else that also took a hit during this transitional period. I'll go ahead and mention Gary Dugan because he is somewhat notorious among the X-Men fan base at the moment. To put his writing simply, he's a heavy-handed writer, meaning his subtext is never actually subtext. It's shoved in the face of every reader who engages with his work. I actually like some of his less pivotal stories a lot more. His Marauders was solid. I really liked his work with the younger Cable, and I even heard that his Iron Man was pretty strong. This all being said, his X-Men was just not it. More specifically, his characterization of Cyclops wasn't it. This isn't really the case initially. His writing was very solid alongside many other writers in Planet-Size X-Men, and the first 2 arcs of his X-Men run had some great moments with Cyclops, the best being Cyclops outing the Resurrection Protocol to the entire world via the press. This whole subplot was arguably the only great aspect to Dugan's run. Before the fall of Dugan's run, there's the Judgment Day event. The event itself isn't terrible, and Cyclops even has a great moment in it where he is judged positively by the Celestials. Minus his corny line about Jean being the only one who can judge him. It was actually cool here, but given that this happens more than once, it's actually pretty insufferable upon rereads. Following the event, there's a couple of meandering issues of varying quality until the Brood mini-event. This has the most interesting conflict between Jean and Scott that I've read in the modern era. It has Scott reacting emotionally to a terrible situation involving his dad, and then Jean talks down to him for a couple of issues, eventually leading to them taking a break. That being a break from one another, in which Cyclops wastes absolutely no time trying to hit up Emma Frost, which seems insanely out of character. Sure, he's cheated on his wife with Emma before, but he at least felt some shame about it. This was such an interesting conflict just for it to be completely ignored with the Fall of X event, in which Dugan's run starts to consistently flop. Scott is taken prisoner, so he doesn't have a presence for most of the event until the latter half. Keep in mind, Dugan's run still isn't concluded, but it does end in June. Apparently, all that time being a prisoner made Scott suddenly get over his argument with Jean, and he's back to worshipping her like a puppy, which has been actively the worst part about Dugan's run. It's as if he views her as a god instead of his wife, and this is where he practically repeats the exact same line from Judgment Day, the whole "only Jean can judge me," except this time it's worded even worse. "I can only be judged by one soul, and I don't think you'd like to meet her." This to me is a foundational issue with Dugan's Cyclops. As long as Jean is present, Dugan cannot let Scott have agency. And if anything actually interesting develops, it has to be reverted immediately. Overall, I'd say I actually have a more positive opinion on Scott during the Krakoan era, but like many eras before, there are logical reasons as to why he's controversial within it. With all of his faults, all his ups and downs, good and bad writers, Cyclops still remains the most well-written and most impactful X-Men, going from the student of Xavier to being the true face of the X-Men within the comics. There are characters with more consistent writing, like Kurt, who might as well be the Daredevil of the X-Men with how well he's written on a regular basis. But to me, it's hard to hold a candle to the era-spanning arcs Scott has gone through. With all that being said, I hope you guys like this. I usually make manga content, and originally I did make comic book content, but it never really did well. This is me trying something different, and hopefully everybody enjoys it. Thank you guys for watching, and till next time, I'm out.